Hope you enjoy this episode brought to you by our sponsors at Peak Tea. Go to peaktea.com/impact and you'll get 5% off your first order. Enjoy the episode. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Conversations with Tom. I am here with Greg Lukianoff. Greg, welcome to the show, man.
Great, let's do it. Thanks for having me.
Dude, I'm really excited about this. So I had first encountered you through you co-authoring Coddling of the American Mind, which was an extraordinary book for me. As somebody with a lot of employees that were much younger than me, it really helped me begin to recontextualize sort of how they'd come up. We will definitely talk about that. But the part that I didn't see coming when I first started researching you was all the First Amendment work and the documentary Mighty Ira, which I had probably heard his name before, but didn't really know about him and his time at the ACLU and, all the stuff that shook down in like Skokie, Illinois and the Nazis marching there. It's like really crazy how at the absolute center of the First Amendment free speech you really are. And I'm really curious, one, how do you describe yourself? And then two, I'll want to know how you ended up as a First Amendment attorney.
Oh wow, that's a long story. I describe myself still as a political liberal, but I think that I'm a little bit of a retro in the sense of I'm like probably a liberal circa 1983. It is sometimes the way I think of it. But the way I came to free speech, I'm a very proud first generation American. My grandfather fought in the Bolshevik Revolution. We could have been labeled Kulaks because we were peasants who made good. My great-great-grandfather
Meaning
was
you were successful. So having read the Gulag Archipelago, what ends up happening to the Kulaks is pretty terrifying.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because in any other country, they were that's a success story. Peasants who were slaves until 1861 to start doing well, and we did really well. We became professors and lawyers, and my grandfather was actually studying at Kiev Polytechnic right at the outbreak of World War One, and that was he was going to be a engineer. Was the idea? But
do you have any sense what made that first generation of your family successful?
No.
It's really interesting.
My grandfather died when my father was 6, and it cut off a lot of that history. There's a lot, it's Russian, so there's constant tragedy. I don't really know. I don't really know how we moved up so quickly.
Why did the Kulaks get turned against? Like, what was it that made them a target for actual murder?
Well, first of all, it's really important to understand that kulak isn't really a thing. It means basically fist in Russian, and it's made up. Like it's basically like it's treating a group of people who are very dissimilar as if they are a group of people, so you can hate them.
What was the thing they used as the similarity to identify them or categorize them?
Peasant farmers who own their own land.
Was it only peasant farmers that were successful, or was it any peasant farmer?
Pretty much, if you owned your own land, you were successful. And so we didn't fit all that well within the theory. Essentially, if the entire system is so rigged that you need a revolution, there is this inconvenient fact that there is at least not a sufficient number of the population, to be sure, and I understand the complaint about that, but there was this large, burgeoning middle class that didn't fit very well within the theory.
And what is the revolution? For people that don't understand Russian history very well, what was the revolution that was being called for, and why didn't that fit the narrative?
Oh man, okay, so that's a long story. Partially because it's all colored by the catastrophic disaster that was World War I in Russia. There was revolts against the Czar in 1905. He set up a parliament. Now, what's amazing is the Czar Alexander II was trying to set up a Duma in 1863, 1862, and he was, and this is after he'd freed the serfs, and he was killed on the way by a revolutionary on the way to trying to decrease his own power, because the revolutionaries thought that would placate the masses too much, and they'd never get their glorious revolution that they want. What they usually kind of a Marxist idea of what the future would look like. So a lot of my family history is like working people trying to actually do do a little bit better in the world, but being frustrated by people who want an all answering, oftentimes authoritarian utopian solution. So, oh, sorry, you go
I
on.
was just going to say part of the reason that I wanted you to walk through that
Yeah,
is the reason I'm so intrigued by what you do and who you are is because I feel like we're hearing some of those similar songs being sung now about people being called out for being successful, that following, logic and things belongs to a certain oppressive group, and to leverage those tools is problematic in and of itself. And so they want to tear that down.
yeah,
And if I remember right, and please jump in, I am not an expert on this, but if
mm-hmm.
my understanding of what happened with the kulaks and ultimately the famines that were born out of basically going, hey, these are the people that ended up owning the land were the successful farmers. They knew
Yeah,
when best, how best to farm, and
yeah,
when you actually kill them, which they
yeah.
did, you go in and kill them.
Five
Now
million.
all the people that know how to farm are dead, and
Yeah,
so now farming doesn't happen, and people
yeah,
starve to death. And it's one of those recognizing, and this is like I was saying before we started rolling, never did I think I would talk about subjects like this until I
sure.
actually started to get worried that this was spiraling out of control, and
Yeah.
that people had these really amazing intentions that history has shown us end in incredibly dark places.
Yeah, and something that's interesting. My father was a radical for being a moderate. When he lived in Yugoslavia, he got kicked out of his. So my grandfather fought in the Bolshevik Revolution. We lost. Like a lot of whites, they got evacuated through Constantinople, which is an interesting story of itself. And a lot of the poorer ones went to Zagreb, in a place that wasn't exactly Yugoslavia yet, which is interesting too. But the real tragedy of my dad's life is that his father then died when he was 6, and he was given away as basically like an orphan, in Yugoslavia in the 30s, which is just an absolute horror show. And it's funny, despite all this stuff, you would think it would make him radical, but he was stuck between the Nazis and the communists, and he thought both were wrong. He actually got kicked out of his high school because he was anti-Nazi, and this was after the Nazis had occupied Yugoslavia. And it's amazing for Americans to think like, how would you feel if on one side you had the absolute, can I say, batshit crazy idea of
You can say
national
anything you want.
national socialism, and then you've got the super murderer of Stalin on the other side, and the fact that he was able to sort of duck and roll with it is something that I'm proud of. So anyway, that's a long way of saying my family has a history of opposing authoritarianism, and I think it's a little bit a part of our personalities too. My mother's British, and she's actually ethnically Irish. Grew up in Britain, was kind of self-conscious about being the Irish girl, so in some ways became more British than the British, and I didn't fully understand that when I was a kid. So, and we grew up in Danbury, Connecticut, which is like in the burbs of New York City. And I got to tell you, like the actual neighborhood I grew up in was amazing because like people have stereotypes about Connecticut. My best friends were from Peru, they were from Korea, they were from Vietnam. The guy used to beat me up a lot was from Puerto Rico. Like we had people. It was really like an amazingly sort of multicultural experience. And meanwhile, within my own house, we had really dramatically different norms about what you should and shouldn't say. So my mom had this exaggerated sense of politeness, and my father has this idea of politeness is a form of deception, which is true ultimately. But so there's a Russian like for in some cases, sort of brutal honesty, and these two things were in tension. So I talk about my second earliest memory. My first earliest memory is my 4th birthday. I got an Aquaman toy and a Jaws doll because it was like
My kind of
77 or
guy.
something like that. And it was Christmas when I was 4, and I got a drum from my auntie Rona. I'd later find out that Rona was just making a joke about giving your best friend kid a drum was just the meanest thing you could do to her, but it was a joke, so it was this crappy plastic drum. And so I was like, it was the first gift I ever got that I genuinely didn't like. And I'm like looking up at my mom, and she's asking me if I like it. And I'm looking at my dad, and I'm like, I have to be polite, I have to be honest, I have to be polite, I have to be honest, I have to be polite. And I just burst into tears. And with my older sister, I'm the youngest of 4, saying, oh, baby doesn't like his present, starts crying. And I'm like, and I wanted to be like, no, that's not what's happening. It's a paradox. Like there's no way to actually resolve this. And so a very early memory was that you cannot be both honest and polite. And then in the actual neighborhood I grew up in, everybody's parents had some other idea of what the appropriate thing would say. And if you actually took everybody's parents' norms for what you were allowed to say, nobody'd be allowed to say anything. So it had to be, free speech had to be the rule. Basically, yeah, sometimes you got punched, for saying the wrong thing. But for the most part, people respected each other as individuals, would hear each other out. And sometimes, and often, surprisingly often, it would actually work out. So I started as a free speech person from a very early age. The next step is college. I was a student journalist, and for a lot of people who are in First Amendment law, where they really get radicalized into it, if you can think of it that way, is the experience of having people come into your newspaper office and demand that you fire so-and-so. And you see the wheels are turning in their heads. They're like, you need to get rid of this columnist, and they haven't figured out why yet. They just know that they're angry about that columnist, but they will figure out, because whatever they think is convenient at the time, because it's defamation, because it's treason, because it's harassment. They'll come up with some kind of argument if you give them anything. And you start realizing that's why free speech has to be so broad and uncompromising, because the human brain is incredibly good at figuring out rationalizations for defeating their enemy. And there's one final step here. It actually relates to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is currently very controversial. But original part of the Communications Decency Act, why it's called that, was a provision that prevented indecency on the internet. Even as a senior in college, I was like, that is laughably, there's no way you can enforce something that vague and broad. And I got really, I got so animated about that, I started studying about it. And that's when I took the LSAT, and that's why I decided to go to law school. And I went to law school and specialized in it, specialized in First Amendment law.
Now, why is that so controversial now? Because it's so impossible to police, or?
Well, oh yeah, I should have finished the story on the original Communications Decency Act. It included a ban on indecency on the internet, and it was in sort of a little bit of heartbreaking timing. I'd spent so many years fighting this, and the decision from the Supreme Court came out right before I started law school, or maybe in my first couple of weeks or something like that. So like, oh, I wanted to be involved in this, but I was too late. Because indecency is just too broad. It's just too vague. It could apply to virtually anything. And the Supreme Court, in an opinion called Reno v. ACLU, said that the internet should be treated very much like you would, like the strongest free speech protections available under the law. And that was like one of the big causes that brought me into this stuff.
All right, so this is where things begin to collide in terms of coddling of the American mind, and this notion that we have, and I know you hate the word coddling, so I'm not trying to be derogatory at all, but we had these good intentions that ended up becoming sort of bad parenting practices because you weren't giving kids the opportunity to sort of go get hurt physically, to get scuffled emotionally, and have to sort of figure their way through that and, develop a robust set of skills for dealing with the world the way that it is. Colliding with this explosion of speech through the internet, and voices that may have once been very, very small now suddenly can get, pretty big attention. And the increasing polarization and the calls for sort of the end of free speech is, quite frankly, what it feels like is just an average Joe trying to make his way in the world here. I think as a way into how you feel about this, I'd love to ask you about Mighty Ira. So one, what was that documentary? And two, you said you were proud of it. Why?
Oh my God, Mighty Ira. Okay, so Mighty Ira. Also, to go back a little bit to how I grew up, the ultimate bad guys as a kid obviously was the Klan. There was. I remember as a kid. They also hated Catholics too, and I was raised Catholic. But just the fact they would hate my friends was truly bad enough. But I remember hearing that there was a group of political liberals who would even defend them, and unlike the reaction it got from some other people, first generation American, kind of proud of how exceptional and strange this place was. I was like. And instead of being critical of them, I was like, that's amazingly principled. Those are people who really mean it. Make no law means make no law. So from a very early age, I was inspired by this person I'd never even heard of. Ira Glasser of the ACLU. And Ira Glasser was he was one of the top people at the ACLU going back to the 60s, but he became executive director of the ACLU in '79, right after the Skokie. The Nazis, neo-Nazis, wanted to march in Illinois, and they wanted to march in a neighborhood that had actually survivors of the Holocaust. Pretty hard stuff. And the ACLU came in and defended them. And honestly, I think that one of the things that really took the teeth out of the Nazi movement of the 1970s was people getting to see what a bunch of horrible buffoons these people were, what a joke these people were. And the person who was willing to go that far and really became the face of the defense of even Nazis. Well, actually, there were several, including Ari Nair, who wrote a book called "Defending My Enemy," which is just a masterpiece on freedom of speech. This is a survivor of the camps who is saying, no, the way we avoid this happening again is not through greater power of authority. It's through a tolerance until it hurts, but zero tolerance for actual violence. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. But people like Ari Nair came up then. Nadine Strawson was just starting at the time, a big name in the ACLU for a long time. And Ira Glasser, and so a lot of the fame of the ACLU being so incredibly principled, that happened on Ira's watch. And Ira is just this amazing model of the kind of civil libertarian I've always wanted to be, which is to care about a variety of issues, but be uncompromising on free speech, even if it goes to to causes that you think are very important and you have positions on particular things. You're not going to try to shut up the people who disagree with you ever. That is just completely outside of bounds. And I know a lot of people from that generation of the ACLU, including my mentor, Harvey Silverglate, who is the co-founder of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which I'm the president of. So
why do you think it's so important to defend your enemy? What is the danger in the breakdown of freedom of speech? Like in the documentary, you guys really do a great job of showing what was going on in Skokie, Illinois, which for those that I was not familiar with it until I watched this documentary. For those that don't know the story, you have these, like you said, neo-Nazis. They want to march. They end up specifically because they couldn't get to the part of downtown Chicago that they wanted to march in. They end up sort of on the outskirts, and they write letters to all these different little suburbs saying, we're going to march to your neighborhood. Everybody ignored them except one, the Skokie, Illinois people. Now, what makes this interesting is they were responding because you have these Jewish people that had survived the Holocaust, tattoos. I mean, they're maybe only 20 years out. It's pretty crazy. Yeah. And they're saying, like, we said never again. And so we're going to rise up. They're threatening violence. And you get these, like, sort of, obviously the punchline is they end up not marching, but before that there was all this violence leading up to it where just sort of showing their face. They were so ready to fight, and the Nazis were, ready to fight. And so they were actually fighting, and it was insane. And so that's the moment where the ACLU is going and fighting and fighting and fighting. And I have to admit, like, watching it as somebody who, not being sort of grounded enough in politics to speak intelligently about the First Amendment other than from sort of a user's perspective. But watching it, I was like, fuck, like, is there a moment where this is too crazy? Where you just say, guys, they still have the tattoos. They're in their, maybe 50s, but they're not like 90. Yeah. And that's gnarly to have people march through their town. So with that setup, I want to know, like, why is it even in that moment still important enough to give them that right?
Yeah, I definitely think there were times during that whole process that, and there was times where people were arrested on both sides for actually engaging in violence, and that's appropriate. But you have to keep a really strong distinction between opinion and action. And it's one of the great innovations in human society. And when people are arguing that words are like bullets, and they think this is this innovative idea that words are violence, it's like, no, that's actually the overwhelming majority of human history. We've treated words as indistinguishable from violence. One of the great innovations that have brought us so much good in the world is this strong distinction between speech and action.
When you say that they were muddled throughout history, what do you mean?
That essentially, if you going back throughout history, that's a little bit. Then I start getting into, the blasphemy law and the way that was like one of the chief ways of limiting speech, in the old days. So prior to, what do I mean by muddled is that essentially it's hard to find moments in history where you couldn't be very quickly hung or executed for saying the wrong thing. And the idea that people are genuinely entitled to their, now the innovation from that, humans' natural state more or less is xenophobic. That, it's really telling that early Greek stories include prescriptions of like, please don't kill strangers, is one of those things that you see, like, ancient bards essentially telling people. And it's funny because you realize these are epic, some of these people spreading the epic poems are actually strangers going from town to town, basically giving stories about why you shouldn't kill me. So hostility towards nonconformity, I think, is baked very much into the human species. You have periods of tolerance. So, like I'd say, there are periods in the Roman Empire where there's comparative tolerance that essentially there's some amount of live and let live with like the Jewish population and different faiths and that kind of stuff. But the real innovation is not just is what John Roush calls liberal science, that everybody's essentially entitled to their opinion. Nobody gets to call special authority on things, and no argument is ever truly over. And this requires a very big distinction between the expression of opinion and action. Whereas, even throughout Western history, opinion and action were muddled in things like, reputational harm. That essentially dueling is a perfect example of what used to be called a culture of honor. That essentially it's up to you to defend your reputation and defend what's yours on your own, usually through violence. The society that me and Haidt end up defending a lot, and I defend in particular, has been named a culture of dignity, which has these ideas about autonomy, separation of opinion and action, of respect for people being entitled to their own opinion, to each their own, respect for, and it always comes embedded with some amount of epistemic humility. Just the idea that there's not just limits to what I know, there's limits to what I can know.
Yeah, that whole and epistemic is one of those words that I had to look up because I had no idea originally what that meant. But that's a pretty good definition, that you just know that you're not going to know everything. And so stepping into the game with that level of humility is incredibly important. So that context to me is so critical for people to understand, one, why I'm so enamored with you as a voice in the world, but two, as to why I think this moment is so important. So I want to go back to the Nazis. They're about to march in Skokie, but now with that understanding of when you look at history through the lens of normally people misspeak and they are killed for it, you begin to understand why it's like, hey, this was an innovation, recognize it as such. We have to now protect this innovation because the alternative is authoritarian and we start killing people for saying things we don't like. And the way that flips and becomes you're the person that people don't like, that gets killed, happens way too quickly.
And that's the thing, is that people sometimes call it like the slippery slope fallacy is what you're worried about in the case of the Nazis. Like, what would be the big deal if we punish somebody as repugnant as that? And the big deal is that that's completely subjective, and who's going to be considered that repugnant is going to move and move and move surprisingly quickly. And this is something that I've seen when people bring up the slippery slope fallacy. In my own career, it's a slippery slope tendency. As soon as you actually give somebody, the idea that wait, I can ban things because they're offensive, and it's like, well, we mean by this Nazis. But I really hate that comedian. I think porn is offensive. I think, and all these things actually happened in the early '80s. I think Dungeons and Dragons is offensive. I think comic books are offensive. All of these things happened, and all you need to do, and that was the thing I learned from working as a student journalist, is as soon as you open a little door for someone's mind to be like, wait a second, you're giving me a weapon over people I don't like? Yay! I'll take it. So you have to police the boundaries of it. Now the Nazi representing Nazis is the absolute high watermark of how far people are willing to go. But the safeguard on that is as soon as people actually start doing things, conspiring towards violence, engaging in crime, then arrest them by all means. But we have to be very sharply protecting the power to have any opinion you want, no matter how aberrant. Now, I actually take it a step further in my own personal philosophy of freedom of speech, and it's this. The project of human knowledge is to know the world as it is. And that means that if you don't know what people really think and why, you'll never no, you'll never understand that. So there's something very primitive about censorship. It's like saying, listen, if you have even if 75% of you have some crazy idea about the nature of the universe or about your fellow man, we don't want to know. It's not important somehow, which is of course nonsense. It's incredibly important to know what people think, not just from a democratic standpoint, which it is, but also from a scientific standpoint, and from a simple wanting to know what the world looks like perspective. There's something childish, frankly, in my opinion, about censorship. The idea that if we don't talk about it at the dinner table, it will go away, and it's like, no, actually, it's still there, and actually, in some ways, because you're not addressing it, it might be getting worse.
Yeah, that I'm going to latch onto that word childish.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like a perfect intersection with coddling of the American mind. So how do we end up here? Like, we go from Ira Glasser, who is Jewish, if I'm not mistaken, defending Nazis because he understands that slippery slope.
He's a Jewish champion of civil rights. And he was with, at the time that there are other people like Harvey Silverglate, Jewish champion of civil rights. But absolutely, one of the ways that they believed you achieve that is by limiting the power of the state. Now, how does that make coherent sense to population, to people, to younger people today? There's a really kind of pernicious reason why it doesn't, and it takes a minute to explain. When I speak on campuses now, and when I speak at high schools, which I'm increasingly doing, I have to explain this very basic thing that I never thought you had to explain before. In a democracy, the power of the majority is protected by the vote. The rich and powerful are protected by being rich and powerful. Literally, the only thing you need a protection of free speech for is for minority opinions, period. And that's one of the reasons why, when you look at the history of the United States, it's only when free speech started becoming powerful, which started at first in 1925. It's a confusing story, but the First Amendment had basically no powerful legal meaning until about 1925. It was very weak. Then after 1925, it started getting stronger and stronger. There was a little dip in the second Red Scare, but then up and up again. It's mostly, an increasingly broad interpretation of free speech. It's no coincidence that that was at the same time that the civil rights movement happened, the gay rights movement happened, the women's rights movement happened, because all of these movements had tried to start before. Including probably, I think even the gay rights movement had tried to start in the 1950s. It was only when in the civil rights movement, there were people who were fighting for that, from day one. Women's rights movement, that goes back to the 19th century, but they're constantly arrested for engaging in free speech. And as the law finally started to live up to what it was meant to mean in the first place, a real broad protection of free speech, that's how you started getting minority opinions out there, and you started getting civil rights and all these other wonderful progressions. Now, why don't younger people understand this? And it comes to something that I think people are sometimes hesitant to say, and I think they should just stop. In K through 12 and higher education, the overall sort of power structure of all these places is very homogeneous in terms of it being politically left. And this is established. This is just clear in overwhelming amount of K through 12 and in most colleges in the country, all of the elite colleges. You have in some departments you have 30-1 in terms of left versus right professors. In some departments you have literally nobody, and administrators, it turns out, are even worse. Now, why does this matter? If for decades there's someone in power, but they don't want to admit they're in power, they don't own their own power, and you're coming up to, and they're basically saying that they would like to be able to punish that person you don't like for their free speech. What you're experiencing is an inversion of the normal power dynamic, where essentially this is the will of the majority on campus, but it's not willing to admit that it's the will of the majority. And the minority opinions are dissenters, whether they be a Brett Weinstein or a conservative or any group of people who don't conform. But because colleges can't own the fact that they are incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, institutions that do tend to be somewhat homogeneous, you end up with generation after generation with an impression that free speech is the argument of the bad guy, that free speech is the argument, and they've never even been taught that it's there to defend minority opinions, because there's this total inversion of their actual experience. And decade after decade, you hear people saying, well, because of that lousy free speech movement, I can't shut down these people you don't like. Without ever explaining to them how that came to be, you end up in this kind of perverse situation where people actually are coming to believe the absurdity that free speech is the argument of power and privilege.
Wow. Okay, that is very interesting. That we've sort of intentionally or unintentionally begun to sort of flip the way that people view that. And I love the way that you said, I would have canceled this, evil, heinous person were it not for that pesky First Amendment. That's really interesting framing that begins to sort of clarify a lot of what's going on.
You have some power, and what's messed up, and like I don't think it's exaggerating to say that this unwillingness to accept its own massive amounts of privilege, power, and wealth, higher education, has also had people, including at my alma mater, Stanford, who write scholarship about restricting free speech that ends up being popular in other countries. So this kind of free speech skepticism has actually been exported, to other countries, even though we protect free speech really, really well in the United States. I think in terms of one of the most fundamental human liberties, a lot of what's come out of campus has been just a disaster for human freedom.
Whoa, that is a very bold statement. Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of increasingly becoming aware of what that output looks like as an employer, more than anything. But that's a really bold statement. So now going to what you guys talk about in the Coddling of the American Mind, there's this. It's almost so weird that I hesitate to take you literally, but you've said it so many times in exactly the same way that I imagine you actually do mean it literally, that somewhere around 2013, 2014, or 2014, 2015, somewhere in there, that seemingly almost overnight, all of a sudden students go from being the biggest champions of free speech. So the administrators are nut jobs that are writing this stuff that's getting exported to, foreign countries that aren't
many of them
friendly
are
to the
very
idea.
nice people.
All lovely people, but we're exporting these ideas that are potentially detrimental, and almost overnight, suddenly it becomes the students who are now fighting against freedom of speech. How? Like, if we were going to intentionally orchestrate that, how could we make it happen at such a specific moment?
I hit that so hard because it's the difference between being someone who studies this and actually being on the ground. Because I'd been defending free speech on campus since 2001, and we kept a really close ear to the ground. We would hear about an awful lot of cases, even obscure schools across the country, and it was pretty reliable. Students were good on free speech. They got it. They would stand up for professors' rights. They got it better than professors. They got it better than administrators. And then suddenly, in this semester 2013, it started more towards the end of the fall semester 2013, and then really exploded in the spring semester 2014. And then, here we are. It's the first time you start hearing of students really organizing in great number to ban particular speakers from campus, to demand new speech codes based on sort of medicalized rationales, whether they be trigger warnings or post-traumatic stress syndrome was one of the things that came up. And it was not in the least subtle. And Coddling the American Mind, I mean, really the whole book is just trying to figure out what was so different about that class entering in 2014, and 2013, 2014. And I got to tell you, doing the research for it, it was fascinating. We didn't, at the time, understand that we were dealing with a new generation of students with pretty remarkably different sets of values and expectations. And we predicted in an article we wrote in 2015 that this would be a disaster for mental health. It's interesting, sometimes it takes a little bit to explain the connection between free speech and mental health, but our original article was trying to explain how we got there. And we thought there was going to be, some modest increase in mental health issues on campus, and it was an explosion instead of, a modest increase.
And, how do we get to the point where you've got people that are beginning to argue for these ideas that they're not, they have flipped, but we're really what we're trying to parse out is how much of this is social media and how much of this is them having to keep everything inside themselves. Because social media I get, just because of the nature of how it affects like the way that your brain is developing and the constant feedback from peers that are hitting you even as you're going to bed and waking up in the morning. I mean, that strikes me as terrifying. But the other side, why would it impact mental health just to have to stay quiet?
Just to have to repress your identity and your points of view is inherently stressful. But when I think about kind of like where a lot of this ultimately comes from, a lot of things that unite my height thinking about it is kind of the sort of runaway sorting, the runaway homophily effect. That essentially social media just sped up a process that was already happening, but it sped it up dramatically.
What's homophily?
The attracted like attracting like, being for people with similar points of view, with similar
homophily. Is that what that's from?
Yep.
Got it. Okay,
love of
cool.
same.
Sorry, yeah, I'm a little slow. Thank you.
And so sorting, I do think that, not to oversimplify it, but I do think a lot of what we're seeing are problems of society sort of super sorting and weird effects that come out of that. And social media is something that sped up that process. So, and one thing that has been interesting in our subsequent research on the social media effect on depression is that we definitely didn't think it was so much screen time as social media, and it looks like the research on screen time is saying something more, that the effect of screen time is more ambivalent, and in some cases for some students, and understandably actually, it can be positive, for example, but that some of the depressive effect might simply come from the fact that in a situation with social media, it's very easy to sort even by temperament. So if like depressed people start talking to depressed people, the Depeche Mode support group is going to probably
really
get more depressed. So I think that some of the effect of social media is actually runaway sorting effects.
We're just subgrouping down, and now we get people that, I'm sure there are some people in an upward spiral, but then there are other people in a downward spiral, and that's being exacerbated. In sort of my area of like mindset, we talk a lot about you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I've tried to get people to think about it in a slightly more expanded way, which is you're actually the average of the 5 ideas you spend the most time with. And if those ideas are being reflected back to you in your Depeche Mode example of the idea that we celebrate is life is, shit, and every day, life's a shit sandwich and every day is another bite. And, you just get into that downward spiral, and then there's cutting and there's, all kinds of crazy stuff that, people can spiral down into. So yeah, I get now what you mean by how that sorting effect becomes deranging.
Yeah, and I do also still think that the part of it that talks about the mean girls aspect is also true, like, because this is hitting young women harder than it's hitting men, and men generally, because we're awful when the hormones start kicking in. Like it's kind of like, I remember being 11, I've watched this in other kids, you have this like weird sort of island of sanity where you're like, what's wrong with all these mildly younger people? And then the hormones kick in and you're nuts, you're just completely insane. But male aggression generally is physical, or fronting, in some cases, or actual violence, or playing football. Like I was actually a defensive tackle, believe it or not. But for women, generally, the aggression is expressed socially. That essentially it's, fighting alliances with friends and gossip and all of this kind of, nastiness that we all kind of remember from junior high. And social media makes that into just a super weapon. Essentially, like, I can't even imagine what one of those scenarios would look like with social media, like if they had it back in the day. That being said, one of the things that I was never able to get enough research on is I do think that in some cases that scenario becoming hot led to the response of the anti-bullying movement. And the anti-bullying movement, although I have a lot of sympathy for it, was very anti-speech. It was very much kind of like, don't offend people, don't hurt people's feelings, all this kind of stuff. And even though I think that a lot of it was well past due, I was never able to really do a deep dive into the anti-bullying stuff, but I do think that lines up also extremely well.
Talk to me about that. So, what would you do? I mean, I know you have young kids. So, let's say that there's somebody in class just being really hateful to them, but it's just speech that never
Yeah,
spills over into, let's say they're not even intimidating them. They're just being mean.
yeah. That's the thing is, I've been writing these things called coddling caveats, where I try to be very clear. I got some advice while we were writing the book that I actually now think we were wrong to follow, which was I wanted to say a lot of times in the book that I'm not good at this stuff myself. I am an anxious parent, like all this kind of stuff. And so, to be clear, I'm not prescribing stuff that I think is easily done, that I find easy. That my wife generally has to remind me to do this. When it comes to meanness, I it was kind of taken, at least when we were kids, it was kind of like just genuine meanness. There was a sense of like, so what? Like the leave me alone. And then there was also a fair amount of actual, hitting, which was not appropriate. I got beat up a lot as a kid, and I wouldn't want any. I wouldn't
Because you were
tolerate
lippy, or why were you getting beaten up a lot?
the nerd.
That's so interesting. I was nerdy for sure, but I didn't get beat up a lot. But the growing up, there was definitely a sense for me, and I think you and I are the same generation. Um,
Gen X?
yeah. So, right? So growing up for me, it was, toughen up. Like if you went
Yeah,
and cried, you'd get made fun of for being the crybaby, and people didn't want to hang out with a person who was always like super easily
yeah,
offended. And it wasn't even that you didn't get it. Like I remember I had one friend who would cry a lot, and I
yeah.
liked him a lot. Such a good dude, and I always just wanted to be like, bro, like you're not making friends every time you cry. Like it turns people off,
Yeah.
and it's
It always
interesting.
broke
And
my heart though when it was clear a kid couldn't control that. I remember just how much sort of visceral pain you would feel when you'd see someone who.
Greg, this is why I don't have children. Because
Oh
I
yeah,
don't know that I could put them in the position to give them the advice that I would give an adult, which is that you've
yeah,
just got to toughen up and deal with it, which, by the way, I think is the answer. And if I were going to
mhm,
sum up our conversation before we started having it with one quote, the thing I
mhm,
really wanted to get across in this whole discussion is prepare the kid for the road, not the road for the kid.
mhm,
And I just thought, yes, like that is so true. There's no way to remove all the potholes from the world, and it turns into a totalitarian nightmare when you try, because
mhm,
people left to their own devices don't gravitate towards that. It's a rough and tumble world that we're in, and the
mhm,
only way to get everybody to like play nice or fair or whatever is to make it such a nightmare and to
mhm,
use violence as a way to stop people from some of their natural inclinations, that the
mhm.
cure ends up being worse than the disease. And
Yeah.
so like you, I don't look at this and say, oh, this would be easy. I look at this and say, this is terrifyingly difficult and is
Mhm,
absolutely one of the reasons that I didn't want to have kids.
yeah.
But when I think about raising a well-adjusted child, like
Yeah.
they're going to have to figure some things out on their way. They as much as no one wants to see their kids take lumps, they're going to have to
Yeah.
take lumps. And
Well, and in some ways, I think we almost see this too much through a negative lens because,
taking lumps,
yeah, but learning how to, because I read this book that was like recommended to me as sort of like a counterweight to Coddling the American Mind, which was called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, which I was like, great, like let's talk about this. And it really is talking about how, to this particular psychologist's mind, there isn't enough research to prove that like that's even a thing, which is like, okay, that's funny. But a phenomena that we've all seen ourselves, but in our own lives. But the thing that I found well, the first thing I found so funny about it was this book railing against snide and oversimplistic dummies, who think that spoiling a child was a real thing. That was said in exactly the tone that the author was claiming was so wrong. It was so snide and dismissive. But there was a section where it was talking about just the horror you do to your child when they have the experience of losing, like a game. Like, can you
that
imagine
letting them
subjecting
lose was a horror.
letting them lose? And it
Interesting.
was this idea of like of failing on a test or failing in the following circumstances. And it's like, you do know there's another side to that, right? Where essentially when you play a sport, for example, you go from like, I'm crushed that I lost, to eventually like, okay, yeah, that's okay, like, because and that empowerment that happens on the other side of it, that can actually even happen pretty quickly, if you let it, where it's like, I handled that. I'm autonomous. I feel pretty good. I feel like I can handle myself. The other thing that you end up producing for that poor kid is a sense that, because what you're really doing is whispering into their ear constantly, you can't handle this on your own.
Mm-hmm.
You need someone up there to handle this for you. And that's dangerous thinking for a democracy, for one thing.
Why
You
is
don't
it
want
dangerous?
the idea that every problem has to be solved by an appeal to authority is a
Why is that
authority.
dangerous, Greg?
Yeah, exactly.
Truly, you said this in an interview. You said that I actually fear centralized authority. I am so aggressively on that team, but for somebody who that doesn't make sense, like, of course, have a central authority, somebody who's looking out for everybody, has their best interests, is willing to, go to war to make sure that they're safe and protected. That sounds amazing. Why is that bad?
Because essentially, what you're trying to do with small L liberal systems is see what happens when humans are empowered individually, and can actually have autonomy over their own life. If you want an appeal to authority, if you want power to be taking care of you under all circumstances, and to take away, the difficulty of everyday life, you're not actually asking for freedom. You're asking for the system as old as time. You're asking for authoritarianism. You're asking for the czar. And one of the reasons why this makes me, why, like my family history, of course, obviously means a lot to me. And when I started studying 19th century, Russian thought, I was shocked to see pro-czarist theorists actually make this argument. The greatest freedom that Russians have is the freedom from. The czar takes away the difficulty of rule, the difficulty of choice, the difficulty of being of all these things you have to worry about. And some of them, like your safety, of course, you do want authority to take care of. But everything else, we take care of the difficulty of being autonomous, the difficulty of being in a democratic society, all the responsibility. We take that from you. And that's the greatest freedom. And I couldn't believe I was reading this. It sounded like the dumbest argument I ever heard in my life. But the more I thought about it, I actually wrote a piece called "Fleabag, Noom, and Censorship Gravity" on my blog, Eternally Radical Idea. It's a very weird post, but it's talking about the show Fleabag, where have you watched that?
I've seen the first season, yeah.
Second season's much better.
That's what I heard. I love the first, so I'm dying to see the second.
The first is she's a genius, but she gives a speech at one point about wanting someone to tell her everything to do, and about how, and she starts crying about the idea of kind of like, I just want someone to tell me exactly what to do, and it scares her how much she wants someone to tell her what to do. With this, and the thing that I love about that scene so much is because freedom is supposed to be scary or you're not doing it right. But it's the only way to get to that sense of autonomy.
Greg, why does it matter? Because I'll give you sort of what I've seen. So one of the ways that I have become effective at being a CEO is that I'm right often enough that the companies become profitable. But the other thing is that I understand humans' absolutely crushing desire for certainty. They need me to be certain. And if I'm certain, they'll follow me. Yeah. And all I need to do to alleviate fear, I don't even have to give you the answer you wanted. I just have to show you that I'm certain that this answer is going to work. And then I will weather that storm. Now, it's very interesting because in the business world, I use that tremendously to my advantage. But in the civilian world, it scares me to death that people want that. So
moral certainty.
What is it that, because what you're presenting, and again, I am with you. I just want you to put words to it. Sure. But what is it that we get from taking on this scary ass responsibility for our own lives of having freedom, having autonomy, having to deal with all that bullshit, making those decisions? What is it we get from that that's worth the price of having to deal with everything?
Wow. It's a great question. And, to a degree, it's overcome. It really is the other side of overcoming your fears. That essentially, if you leave someone in a situation where all their problems are handled by some third party, there's always that sort of fear in their belly that essentially, if they didn't have this support, they would never make it. The sort of pride and confidence that you can leave after having lived through a real a real crisis. It shouldn't take a real crisis to give you that experience of autonomy, feeling fully realized, all of these kind of things. And I think in terms of a thriving, fulfilling life, if you're always whispering into your own ear that you can't really handle life on your own, that you can't really handle most situations on your own, that's depression. That's and that's one of the reasons why I think one of the reasons why you have such high rates of depression, and unfortunately suicide and anxiety among a lot of these students going to elite schools, because they're being told their entire lives, yes, you're very bright, but you're not capable of handling your own life because the real world is terrifying. But of course, as soon as you actually face some of those terrors, since it's kind of like getting through your early 20s, which can, for a lot of people, can be a very dark time. And then you come out on the other end of it and you're like, this isn't so bad. I can do this. And it feels like being a fully realized person. But you need to be able to, have that internal locus of control, that internal sense of autonomy for things like, actualization, for mental health, for creativity, all of these kind of things. Can you live a fulfilling life where you can't make where you don't feel confident that you can make any meaningful decisions for yourself? Maybe, but it's not one I'd like to live.
I will say that I don't think it's possible. And the reason that I don't think it's possible, and the reason that I think autonomy is so critically important and that people have to get it together and take control of their own life is, so I'm flirting with this idea I call the physics of being human. And I believe that the human mind, no matter where you're born, no matter what time period, there are certain things that your mind is compelling you to do. So we are an active species. So if you leave us alone, we're going to map out our environment, try to figure it out, try to dominate it, get resources from it, food, water, shelter, all that. Like you don't have to tell people to do that. They will just do that. It's a natural impulse. Same with sex. Like you've got these things that are propelling you forward. I think one of them is this desire to have autonomy, that it is pre-programmed into your mind. And no matter what I do, if you don't have that, there will be a certain level of anxiety. Now, I'm the guy that just said people love certainty and they love to follow you. But there is this, what you were talking about, there's this thing running in the back of their mind that says, I don't know how to do this. And because I don't know how to do it, if there isn't somebody there, and you have enough moments in your life where you're paralyzed because there's nobody there to help you, and that is so demoralizing and terrifying in such a horrible place that you carry that then forward with you in your life. So I believe because that we have this subconscious process running in the human mind that tells us that we need to do hard things in service not only of ourselves but other people, no matter who you are, unless you're a sociopath, that is running in the back of your mind, that you have to get good at something that matters to you and matters to other people. And then, and this is the key, if I were to sum up the one thing I'm trying to get the world to understand, it is this: skills have utility. Meaning, if you learn how to do something, you're no longer beholden to anybody else. So I'll use movie terms here real fast. So one of the most horrifying moments in any movie ever for me, or book for that matter, since it's based on a novel, is the moment where Oliver and Oliver Twist comes up and says, "Please, can I have some more?" And he doesn't get to decide whether he has more. And of course, the guy goes ballistic. And this is exactly why I ended up getting into business. I went into film and I couldn't get films made the way that I wanted them made. And somebody gave me the key insight. Hey, you're coming to the world with your hand out. And if you want to control the art, you have to control the resources. So I thought, oh my God, that's amazing. If I go get rich, then I can do things that I want to do. But to get rich, I had to get good at something the world cared about. And I had to be able to offer more value. And so that process of going in and fighting to get better every day and then realizing, oh my God, I've learned a set of skills that allows me to get a group of people galvanized around one idea, moving in the same direction with speed. We can create things of value. And now, not only do I have resources financially, but I have intellectual resources that I can leverage to get other people to help me do something to have a meaningful impact in the world. Now, when I think about how I feel about myself now, where I know I have that locus of control, I look at the world and go, whatever it is that I set my mind to, I can make a major impact in the world. Versus how I felt, you said early 20s is a dark period. That shit was really dark for me. And the reason it was dark was I had a big dream and I had no idea that I even needed skills to go and get better, that I could acquire new skills because I thought that I was born with a certain set of talents and that was it. So once I realized, oh, okay, so Steve Jobs says, look around the world. It was built by people no smarter than you. Meaning, if you want to go build a bridge, go learn how to build a bridge. You want to build houses, be a great teacher, be a teacher, author, whatever. You can learn how to do it. Go actually do it, and then the world will begin to change from your inputs, either in small ways or big ways, depending on where you want to play. So when I think about that whole causal sequence absolutely being true and being an echo of these sub-processes that evolution has baked into our mind, whether we want them there or not, regardless of who our parents are, no matter what time period we were born into, there are these sort of evolutionary pressures pushing us in these directions. If you hand your locus of control off to somebody, not only do you now have an inability to manipulate the world around you, not in a negative way, but to change the world around you, but you also never realize that desire to have autonomy and to get skillful.
Yeah, and the fears just seem bigger and bigger. I mean, that's something that all of us have experienced, and something I am trying to I am already teaching. I have a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I am trying to very much say, face your fears, do this thing, plant yourself, get embodied, and because Kate Julian wrote this piece for the Atlantic that was sort of like a continuation of some of her themes in Coddling, and it really hit hard the harm of having anxious kids. And that how much you have to address your child's anxiety, and how much of that anxiety actually comes from the parents in the first place. And there was a horrifying line that you really have to take seriously. Like if you have a kid who's afraid of dogs, that if you accommodate that too much, it spirals into 12 things that they're afraid of, and something that can be really horribly life limiting. It's absolutely amazing piece. That I was able to read, that I recommend by Kate Julian. But to your point about sort of like small empowerments and knowing how to do things, I think one thing that affects that I actually don't talk about very publicly, and I'm going to talk more about it, is I'm dyslexic. It means that honestly, as an adult, it doesn't hurt me all that much. I listen to everything I can. I listen to audiobooks. I have the apps that read things to me. Spell check's a godsend. Dictation. All of these kind of like fixes make it more like a minor inconvenience as an adult. So, but I always think that gave me one huge advantage. I always knew I wasn't good at everything, and so I had to delegate on the stuff I wasn't good at. But I also was desperate to know how to do something, and we were poor when I was a kid, so I felt so unsafe in a literal financial sense because we were really struggling when I was a kid until my dad started working again when I was 12. But I still had that mentality that I needed to learn how to do something, so I became a cook. And once I knew how to cook, it was just like, and this was in high school, I was like, well, I can always go be a cook. and I meant it, it was and my brother's the same way, where it's just like, everything falls apart, I still have something that I can do. And that gave me a sense of sort of like safety in everything else. And it didn't come from outside. It came from like one of my best friends, a carpenter. It's kind of like, I know how to do all this stuff. Like if everything falls apart, I can still do these things.
I'm excited to tell you all about Peak Tea. Listen up, my friends. If you're looking for ways to support healthy immune function right now, you need to hear all about Peak Tea. Peak is a brand our team here at Impact Theory has loved for years, and they just released a game changer in vitamin C supplementation. It's an elderberry liposomal C called Daily Immune that one of our Impact Theory members is happy to be adding to his daily routine. What makes Daily Immune so effective is that it is maximized for absorption. Most vitamin C supplements absorption decreases to less than 50% when taking amounts greater than 1,000 milligrams. So you actually end up peeing most of it out. Peak has solved this problem, however, by encapsulating their vitamin C in liposomes. Liposomes are made from the same material as your cells. They can bypass absorption barriers to deliver vitamin C where you need it. Daily Immune is also the only triple power vitamin C formula around. In every packet, you get a whopping 1,900 milligrams of elderberry superfood complex. That's the equivalent of up to 13 grams of fresh black European elderberries. Plus, you get 1,000 milligrams of sodium ascorbate, which is a buffered form of vitamin C that's gentler on your stomach. But wait, there's more. Daily Immune is made with just 7 clean ingredients. No preservatives, no refined sugars, no additives, and unlike most liposomal supplements, Daily Immune tastes amazing Thanks to the pure elderberry, apple, and lemon fruit concentrates. It's so easy to take too. The packet fits right in your pocket. When you're ready to take it, just squeeze it right in your mouth. No glass, no water, no spoon needed. You can stash them anywhere and take them on the go. Peak is a brand our team at Impact Theory has loved for years, and if you want the powerful antioxidant benefits of vitamin C from Peak, we have a special offer just for our audience. If you go to peaktea.com/impact right now, you'll get 5% off your first order. Most people are ordering 2 or more, so stock up before they sell out. Once again, that's 5% off at peaktea.com/impact, and Peak Tea is spelled PIQUETEA.com/impact. Take care and be legendary.
And the small empowerment of these little things really, really matters. And so we focus so much right now in high schools and unfortunately ideology, whereas I think that if you actually were to teach people how to do practical things, and I mean this for students at every level, it would give them a sense of empowerment that's only possible by actually doing things, not just saying, oh, let's increase your self-esteem.
Talk to me about trigger warnings. That's something that, given all the things that we've talked about today, doesn't strike me as the best way to move through the world. That while there are no question that there are some things that people have been through that are so traumatic that I would get why they would want to avoid them in the future. Sure. But much like you on freedom of speech, you need to fight for your enemies' right to say what they're going to say, no matter how horrible and despicable. I would think that in terms of healing and moving forward, that just trying to, like you said, with the, if your kid is afraid of dogs and you really try to protect them and coddle them, that actually gets worse. It doesn't get better. That you'd be better off. Like, I make rules in my life, and I will tell you one rule for myself. No matter what has happened to me in my life, I want exactly 0 trigger warnings. I do not want people trying to prepare the road for me. Like, I would rather steel myself so that I can navigate.
Trigger warnings are kind of a funny one because they have such symbolic power in the country that they're definitely something that there are people who seem to be willing to fight and die on the hill of trigger warnings are good. And when I first heard about them, I was a little bit puzzled by exactly what to make of them. And definitely, like most movements in censorship, the intention is always good. Someone thinks they're saving the world or saving the soul of America, or in this case, trying to help people who are genuinely hurting. But it was interesting that they came up on campus with such a vengeance in 2013, 2014, because they'd more or less just been almost laughed out of existence on the internet. Because in feminist circles, they were being made fun of because originally they started from very understandable, someone saying, trigger warning, I'm about to talk about sexual assault. But every time people started using them, they got requests for more and more and more things that people were claiming to be afraid of or triggered by. And it just wasn't sustainable. Now, this makes sense because if people understand what triggers people, what triggers people doesn't necessarily make sense. That essentially, if you are the victim of assault, it's not necessarily watching a movie about assault that's going to trigger you. From a psychological perspective, it could be a particular smell. It could be the color yellow. The brain doesn't work all the time in this perfectly linear way that watching a movie about war can make you feel like you're back in the war. It can actually be something, it can be a random song playing that can cause you triggering. So the fact that triggers are not nearly as linear as people would like to think they are. But our initial opposition to them, or our initial concern to them, was that it was kind of like telling people in the legitimately safe space of the classroom that this is still such a big scary thing that we should never even talk about it. Now, in our opinion, that has the power of making things that you're frightened of not seem bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful. And that was kind of our theory, that essentially, and when Kate Mann attacked Haidt about it, he was saying that, that's like saying in the New York Times, said something to the effect of, like Haidt would just like to deal with people with arachnophobia by throwing by throwing spiders on them. And I gave away the punchline, but Haidt's response was like, no, what I'm saying is you should be able to talk about Spider-Man around someone with arachnophobia, that essentially, it's a very different, just being able to talk about something is actually very different. Now, here's what kills me though. there have now been like 4 studies, maybe even 5, on trigger warnings. Not a single one shows any benefit at all to them. Several of them show that they increase ambient anxiety. The people who don't have PTSD are suddenly a little bit more afraid. One of the studies gave some good reason to believe that increases people's sense that words are inherently harmful, which is, of course, a very serious harm in a democracy. And one of the studies, I believe, showed that people with PTSD had actually made them worse, even for people with PTSD. So there's now a body of research that says this isn't actually helpful. This actually can be counterproductive. But the people who believe in it just won't give up on it. And it's like, but what else can you do other than prove that it's not helpful? And if you really genuinely have compassion for the people that you're trying to help, you should be able to be moved by what does actually help them.
Yeah, that's exactly where I come down on the issue. Is I get why people, when you have compassion for somebody else and you hear that something might be distressful for them, it's like, oh man, yeah, of course. Like, I don't want to upset you. But when you magnify that out over however many people, and some of them it's in good faith, some of them honestly are just, their sensitivity level is dialed way too high. And so it's like you can't even have conversations now, and it just begins to stunt other things like freedom of speech or education, like just not being able to talk about certain things. And that's where I come down to, okay, well, what really works? And if trigger warnings worked and it was making the world a better place and people were, more, they were able to heal and then move on, like, okay, cool, I would get it. But it feels a little bit like the tyranny of the minority to me. So it's, a small handful of people on any given subject. And now it's like so much of the discourse is clogged with, trigger warnings, or shouldn't you avoid that? Or a nice person wouldn't talk about that. And it's like, Jesus, like we can't talk about anything because something is offensive to everybody. And that's even before people start using it sort of pathologically of just trying to shut down somebody they don't like and using it as a cudgel. So where do you think we go with this? Like, as a First Amendment attorney, is this something like, is there a way to memorialize this? Like, how do we keep this from spiraling? How do we get colleges back to the point where people went there with a radically open mind?
That's a great question. And I have to say, I'm feeling pretty pessimistic about it at the moment, more so than I have in some time, partially because I do think that the layer upon layer of different sort of ideological assumptions and rhetorical tactics means that the people on the other side of free speech can always win, and you really just have to get out of the system entirely. Something that I was never all that bullish on, that I'm now very bullish on, and this is breaking news as far as any podcast I've ever done. There's something called the Calvin Report. Have you heard of it? At the University of Chicago. I think in 1967, the guy who came up with the term heckler's veto is a famous jurist, famous lawyer, and he wrote a report for the University of Chicago during the time when universities across the country had activists who were demanding that they take political positions. And I've had a real rude awakening on something that was very dear to my heart. Is that I always kind of assumed that the free speech movement, starting in Berkeley in the 1960s, that the opponents of that were essentially conservatives who wanted patriotism and mom and apple pie. And I'm embarrassed to realize that actually the argument was that mostly, at the time, campuses were still decidedly liberal, but it was more like 2 or 3 to 1 rather than, 30 to 1. But the professors wanted the university to be a special place that did its best to be outside of politics, because it's our institution for creating ideas. It's our institution it's one of our epistemic institutions, because reality is hard to know and we need these special areas. And so in 1967, the University of Chicago came out with the Calvin Report, basically saying, we have a very special function in society. We should be very hesitant to ever take political positions. We should always be open to the possibility we might be wrong. All of this stuff that originally, for most of my career, I was like, well, that's nice, but universities, can engage in free speech of their own, and departments can engage in free speech of their own. But what's happened without this, having completely abandoned the monastic idea of higher education, we've ended up in a situation where that idea has almost like been flooded out. And I do think that some schools, and I think this for some corporations, have to get back to being able to say, no, it's not our job to decide what the truth is in advance. The more we freight truth with assumptions that we have, the less likely we are to get it. I call it the ideological uncertainty principle. Essentially, the more you assume it has to go in a particular direction, the more likely you're going to get the truth wrong. So increasingly, I have all sorts of ideas for reforms for higher education, but the most radical one that I've come to after a long period is that some schools have to say, listen, we're neutral on political issues. We believe that our department should be neutral on political issues. Professors and students are free to have whatever opinion they want, but as an institution, we are. It's not our job to decide what truth is. It's not our job to impose our politics on you. And I think we need institutions like that.
So this was, I think I've heard of this, but under a different name. So University of Chicago, is that the one?
University of Chicago.
They were known as like sort of the big stalwarts, as sort of wokeism were sweeping the nation. They didn't. And I remember Brett Weinstein saying if there were some universities that were woke and other universities that weren't, then you would get, I think he says game theory, basically the ones that provided the worse graduates, because the education itself was getting muddied by politics. They would end up losing out to the people that weren't woke and were still using just straight scientific method and putting out the most people with the highest level of useful skills out into the world. And so over time that would sort itself out. And his big lament, I think, was this, that Chicago, University of Chicago, sort of the last holdout, had finally sort of given up as well and embraced a lot of these other policies.
University of Chicago hasn't given up, but it is being eroded. We have a case involving Dorian Abbott at the moment where he's a professor who came out and said something that was very like common humanity, identity politics, talking about we're going to help elevate women, not by trying to foster excellence and finding people who get by not evaluated on their identity, but on their success, and all this kind of stuff that would have been absolutely coherent even 15 years ago is now treated as if it's a demonically horrible thing to say, that he doesn't think they should be engaging in different kinds of affirmative action and identity politics. And there was a massive movement to just get this guy kicked out. There was a change.org petition against him. He now has like a section where he only teaches like one person. He's been turned into a pariah, even at University of Chicago. And that's bad. That essentially what the right response, for an institution that's supposed to figure out truth is, you're entitled to your opinion, and this is not the end of the world that someone at the university disagrees. And the idea that we're even reached the point where it's a massive controversy when someone says something that wasn't controversial 15 years ago is being treated like a pariah. That's a problem for the production of ideas. And what it leads to, unfortunately, is a huge epistemic crisis. That essentially, when you look at people on the right who now believe in hoaxes and the election was fixed and all this kind of stuff, I absolutely blame them for being superstitious and for believing in conspiracy theories. And I think that I don't forgive them that at all. I do, however, understand that they don't really trust what comes out of higher education all that much. They don't trust what comes out of mainstream media. And if you ask people in these institutions, it's like, well, that's just crazy. I'm like, really? You see no reason why they think that it's rigged against their point of view. And when you don't have institutions that everybody trusts, that's really hard for democracy. So like one place where my brain's been at is like, we need some absolutely brand spanking new institutions that involve people who are trusted by people, just simply to tell us what the world actually looks like to some degree, because it's hard to know what the world looks like. It takes work to know what the world looks like. And if you don't have any source that inspires cross-partisan trust, we're in real big trouble. And people not trusting a lot of higher education, after what I've seen for 20 years, I don't entirely blame them. That's not to say that there aren't scientists within higher education that are absolutely amazing and understand the world better than anybody on certain topics. But as an institution, I don't blame him for being kind of skeptical of it when particularly when you make it so that there was a situation where there was a professor who came out with a study about police violence, and just in the last year, and it was essentially withdrawn because conservatives were using it. People like Heather McDonald were making arguments based on it, and that's crazy. Like the idea that kind of like, so already there's very few people who will make controversial arguments in some of these departments. Already there's tremendous groupthink in these departments. But if someone publishes something that is factually based but can be used by someone you don't like, you withdraw it. Like that's why should anybody trust what you come out with if it's that stacked against certain outcomes?
Do you have a sense of how we've become so blind to this? Like, as sort of a late entrant to thinking about the culture wars and stuff, and as a business person, I'm always asking myself, okay, what is my goal and what works? What's actually going to get me to my goal? And it seems so self-evident when something isn't working. How is it that we're living through a world where people can't see the sort of history death loop that we're in? They I would assume they would take as is absurd on its face the following statement, which to me seems self-evident, that the only way to get everybody to think the right way is through violence. And that experiment has been run, and it leads to the greatest atrocities of the last 200 years. You know, I mean, maybe more than that. So how are they blinded to that?
Of the governments of Hitler and Stalin, that was definitely on a scale of thoroughness that was really hard for any previous civilization to achieve. Just absolutely monstrous. Anyway, sorry.
So how does this blindness come to be? It just seems so weird. Like there's really smart people. In fact, you and Brett Weinstein were talking about the fact that really smart people tend to get drawn to some of these ideologies. And so what is it about legitimately smart people? Like I'm not looking down on them. I'm worried. And so I'm asking the question of, hey, these amazing, compassionate, wonderful people are missing what seems to me to be, hey, whenever you're like running a test, the whole idea of running the test is to have learned from it. And so it's like, we've run these tests of trying to force everybody to think in the same way. They end in bloodshed of like magnitudes that are terrifying.
Yeah.
Why does that not seem obvious to them?
There's so many different answers to it. I mean, I could go all the way back to Plato, who I think is a totalitarian monster who we dress up as if he's an okay person.
It's funny, I've never heard anybody say that before.
Who wanted power for himself and people like him. People would talk about, oh, the Republic was just a metaphor for the soul. It's like, no, it was his very academic idea of the way the world should be run, and they should be incidentally run by people like Plato, like Plato himself. And I think that there's a monstrousness in sort of Platonic philosophy that is essentially, the idea of the forms is essentially that the ideas in my head are more real than you. And
would they actually say that?
That the ultimate real things the ultimate real things are otherworldly, perfections of the beauty and of the circle. Yeah, I mean, the world of the forms was a real thing. That is bizarre. And so the academic idea that essentially my academic theory, my beautiful, permanent, eternal construct, is all that matters, is a formula for great evil. Because
we can substitute sort of the perfect circle with utopia. So it's like my idea of and I'm trying to put it in today's, the minds of people existing today. Are you saying that some percentage of them are thinking the utopia itself is more real or
more important?
More important. Thank you. I wanted to use that, but I wasn't sure that you would go for it. So the utopia is more important than you. And therefore, it's that whole terrifying example of if you want to make an omelet, you got to crack some eggs. Is that what you think? Like they're in the grips of that sort of mental loop?
I think that it's a very common mental loop. I think that there's a huge human drive towards conformity. One of the reasons why I find Plato so incredibly instructive is because this idea of the ideas are more important than anything else, and that they're permanent, by the way, and I have access to them and you don't. That's evil in my mind. One of the greatest innovations in human history was, I forget who the philosopher was who called it this, was the discovery of ignorance. The belief that in the grand scheme of things, you know extremely little. And all of us know extremely little, and that none of us are very bright in isolation. And it might be part of my personality. I actually take great joy in not knowing things. It feels wonderful, to be in awe and to not have certainty. But I too, sometimes feel the pull of certainty. And once you have the idea, whether that's utopia, whether that's perfect equality, perfect justice is the greatest of all ends, people are just abstractions, and some of them are in the way. And I think that unfortunately is a very normal part of the way human thinks. And we have this harder system that requires doubt and tolerance and always recognizing you might be wrong, and that there's a speech by Learned Hand in 1944 that has a line that I love quoting because it confuses people when I say it now. It's the true spirit of liberty is that which is not that is not too sure that it is right. And people are like, what is that? What is that, a cone? Like, what does that mean? But it is ultimately this idea that, yes, you can work for progress, but you always have to take seriously the possibility you might be wrong. And if you think there's absolutely no chance that you are wrong, and that you're absolutely on the right path towards salvation or God or utopia, and nothing can stand in your way, that's when the greatest evils in human history happen. And these weirder, less comfortable, less certain ideas of human autonomy and freedom and doubt and empiricism and all this stuff, that's a very hard way to live, for people. It's much easier to come to these sort of like simplistic binaries or ideas of utopia or all that kind of stuff. So I think there's always a call bringing it back. Our institutions, though, that are supposed to break us of this way of thinking are K through 12 and higher education, particularly higher education. And unfortunately, I think they're pushing us in a oversimplified, over-politicized idea of humanity, of society, that did try to come into existence several times and was a huge failure, and is somehow rearing its ugly head again. I'm not sure how we exercise the sort of simplistic moral utopian certainty that keeps on asserting itself from the 19th century on. I hope we can. I thought we had in 1989 and 1991. But literally, as someone whose family fought the communists since before they even had a name, and then literally fought them, and not my actual granddad, not my great grandfather, fought them. The idea that this is, I'm reading more stuff about literally like people talking about communism being like a swell thing again, even though within our own lifetimes it was so conclusively a disaster. And that's partially because there was never a reckoning on campus to deal with the ideology was just allowed to stay the same. And it didn't have to comport with the real world. And once you get far enough away from the examples of these collapses being fresh in people's mind, let's go for utopia again. What's the harm?
This is what really worries me. So there's a point when my wife and I are in an argument where it starts civil, and there's, emotions aren't too heated, and we're doing just fine. And, you can see the exit ramp, and we know how to, navigate our way. And then there'll be something that we'll hit on that's just, maybe one person's raw that day for whatever reason, and you can feel the emotions escalating. And I have learned to articulate a very simple idea in the middle of that argument, which is we are now at the point where no matter what we say, this is going to end up in a full-blown argument. Because now it's not like logic and rationality don't matter anymore. This is all just emotion. And once we have the fight, then we can calm down again, because it reaches sort of that crescendo of absurdity where we go, okay, this is dumb. We're not even arguing about the thing anymore. We're just pissed. But knowing that there's a moment where a tipping point where you can't go back now until you go all the way. It's kind of like Ipecac. Once you take it, you are going to vomit. And I'm very hopeful. And the reason that I've started talking to people like you is I'm very hopeful that we are not at that moment yet. But I am hyper aware that as a society, we are racing towards the moment where the only thing that will calm us down again is great tragedy. And people will once again have to see what happens when the sword of Damocles falls, when we try to build a utopia, like what the sort of, like, because eventually you get into the mix of it and you go, oh, now I get why this sucks, right? But that it can be, and unfortunately, too many lessons in my own life I've had to learn the hard way. People have tried to tell me, and I just couldn't see it until I was in it. And then when you're in it, you can sort of unwind. But the thing that I have, working in the inner cities, has taught me one very powerful thing. Frame of reference is everything. So I can just tell you from experience that IQ is distributed evenly, right? So you go into the inner cities, you're going to find people there that are extraordinarily bright. And I will define IQ as the ability to process raw data quickly. But if IQ is more or less the hardware, what I call the frame of reference is the software. What do you believe to be true about yourself? What do you believe to be true about the world? The easiest one is something that's near and dear to your heart, cognitive behavioral therapy. If you don't realize that it is a cognitive distortion to do fortune telling or all or nothing thinking or catastrophizing, like if those just seem true to you and you don't recognize catastrophizing isn't true, it's your mind projecting and you deciding to believe that that is actually true. If you don't recognize it, then there is no difference between that and truth. And so you see, before this was a controversial statement, I've been saying this for a long time. Now I'm sure one day people are going to show up at my house with pitchforks. But I would say that generational poverty has nothing to do with money and has everything to do with mindset. Meaning, if I were to take a child, let's say they were 6 months old and they were from impoverished parents, and I raised them in a wealthy environment, they'll grow up just like a wealthy kid, right? They'll be educated. All the intellectual prowess didn't matter. Same genetics, but raised one way or the other makes all the difference. And so I tried to break it down to what is this really? And came up with this concept that I call frame of reference. And the way that I came to it was we were growing so fast as a company, hiring so quickly, I had to find shorthand ways to interview people. And I started asking this magic genie question. You'll just have to trust me that it made sense, that one of the things I was trying to understand required me to figure out what they wanted out of life. And so I would ask the magic genie question. And I asked it, I don't know, 250 or 300 times. So the question was, hey, a magic genie is about to show up. They're going to grant you one wish and one wish only. You can't wish to cure cancer or bring somebody back from the dead. It has to be just for you. What do you want?
Molecule Man powers.
Say that again?
From the comic books, there's a character called Molecule Man. I want his powers.
I'll have to look that up. Something tells me I have thought about what if a magic genie were to ever come, what would you do? And the answer is the ability to, through simple language, manipulate molecules. So I'd be so curious to know if that actually is his power.
Molecule Man, and when people hear me say this, they're kind of like, so you want the power of a god? I'm like, well, he can control molecules and energy. And so when since I'm a nerd and I go through like the process, I have thought at great length, like, what if you had the whole Justice League? How much of the world could you fix? And it's not that much, except for Firestorm. Firestorm, who can like change matter. And and when you start, when you want to like make Mars habitable or clean up, take all the mercury out of the ocean or all this kind of stuff, like you need to start thinking really big. And so like my wish, Molecule Man.
Dude, that is hilarious. You're the only person ever that has had the same answer that I have. That is incredibly wise of you, sir. Now, sadly, that was not the answer that people were giving me. I asked it, like I said, 250 or 300 times. Every single person gave the same answer, and the answer was $1 million. Now, they were there for a job, so sure, I get it. But I thought, why don't they ask for an impossibly large amount of money? Why not $1 trillion or a money printing machine that would give currency that will always be accepted?
Yeah, I'd like to pay off the national debt.
Right. But instead, they asked for $1 million. And I realized to them, from their frame of reference, $1 million was an unimaginably large amount of money. Yeah. And that's when it hit me. Oh my God. Like their vision of what is possible is so small that $1 million is just like, oh, that's outside the realm of possibility. Whereas for me, it was like, you can't even buy a house in LA for $1 million. This is crazy. Yeah. Like you've got to be dreaming bigger.
What's really funny about this is that I have both the same personal experience working with inner city high school kids in DC in the 90s, and I got to work with like the really bright ones too. And there was kind of almost nothing sadder because the DC inner city schools in the 90s were horrifying. Like I had students coming like right after there'd been a shoot, like right after there'd been a shooting, and they were kind of a little shook up because it had happened multiple times. And these are kids who have to really hide their smarts because they'll get beat up for it, you know. But also, I grew up poor, you know. Like I didn't think I wasn't sure I was going to go to college. I started working in restaurants when I was 11. I definitely had a pretty strong working class kind of bias, and it was only and I went to the first for college. I went to the first school I visited. Basically, I visited school. I'd done well on the SATs. They gave me a scholarship. I was like, sure, okay. And so I went there, and I got and I kind of thrived in college. I got to finally like be a nerd, and let my nerd out of the closet. And there was a time when I was doing something for the Fulbright program, and I met this dude who was a barrister slash lawyer, human rights international practitioner who did stuff in South Africa and in Europe, and it was. And he was talking to me, and it was like something inside me was cracking. Like it actually felt physically painful to think for a second, like, could my life look anything like that? Because there was still this powerful separation in my mind between me and people who are doing really amazing things. Those were different kinds of people. And so when I worked with inner city, and this was like right before I started working with these kids, and yeah, like there is a sense of kind of like what's the big sky option, you know, like what and one big limitation on this, by the way, is the fact that police one of the is that classes kind of economic classes kind of police themselves to a degree, but there is a sense kind of like, so you know, let for some of these kids. So I go to college, you know, and I leave all my friends, and they what's out there for me that isn't some kind of betrayal of the people that I come from was something that I saw a lot about, that I found very, you know, disempowering. But yeah, believe me, that mindset aspect, the idea that there is something out there that could be beyond, you know, your previous frame of thinking was literally physically painful the first time it occurred to me.
That's a great way to say it. And that's why this moment is so freaky to me, because that frame of reference is so hard to break. Like you said, it can feel like a betrayal, or it feels like a physical schism. And there is a frame of reference right now that is utopian. And so people want this pure utopia. And when you argue against it, you sound like a monster. It's like, because the utopia, if it could be real, really is amazing. It sounds absolutely fantastic. And the problem is that once you put it back in the real world and make it about actual human beings, then it is so unrealistic as to require what we've already talked about multiple times, that draconian, like you would have to enforce it through violence, intimidation, just literally crushing people down. And that's where it's like, man, how do you get somebody to turn away from a utopia? Like that sounds about as hard of a frame of reference to pull somebody away from as I can imagine, because you're asking them to accept a lesser view, right? You talked about I think it was the Czar that ended up getting murdered by a revolutionary, because it was like, that's not enough. Like it's better, but it's not enough better. And so fuck you, we're going to kill you. And so,
and it might be enough better that it placates the population, and that would be a disaster, because then we won't get to perfection. And one of the things that I've had lots of arguments about this stuff in backyards in San Francisco, and of course I can always pull the actual family history card. But one thing that I always have to point out is none of these systems deal well with human diversity. If you care about diversity, and I explain this in terms of communism, like the idea that kind of like if you're going to be paid the same amount for working 40 hours a week really well, and you could get away with 20, isn't there also a moral argument that you should be spending that 20 hours with your family? It's not. So if there's a singular moral vision, it never works with human diversity. It never works with human skills, human knowledge, and the idea that some of these utopias are done in the name of diversity. It's like, yeah, but utopias can't compute diversity. Like they need conformity, or they don't work. More enlightenment-like systems that actually, like kind of like the one we have, where essentially we figured out a system constitutionally. One of the reasons why I love the Constitution so much is where even if people are acting horribly, the system can still hold together. Whereas in communism, when you require everybody to be angels, that gives the sociopaths superpowers. Whereas if you create checks and balances that say, like, listen, even if you're being lousy, we've got a way of dealing with this internally, then you have a stable system. But all of this takes It can't be simple. It takes being honest about human limitations, and the fact that, for example, and it's something that I have to say sometimes when I'm dealing with like due process cases. I remember dealing with a case with Wendy Murphy, who was talking about how people accused of assault on campus should essentially have no due process. And she started on a radio show, started shouting at me. It's like, you're saying that women lie. It's like, I hadn't said anything like that. This was my second time on a radio show. And I said, well, actually, all due process requires is that people can be mistaken. They don't even necessarily have to lie. But also at the same time, people lie. And the idea that people can be dishonest, people can be abusive, of course we can be. You also have to make sure that you're not being gamed, and all of these like perfectly normal parts of human nature, they don't match well with the utopian vision, and that's one of the reasons why they will end up as authoritarian nightmares.
So if we both agree that we have a frame of reference problem, you've got people stuck in a loop of wanting to build the utopia, which is actually quite noble, and you want to commend the level of compassion. How do you think that we're already past the tipping point? Is it inevitable that we're just going to continue on these terrifyingly divergent paths until something truly erupts into either authoritarianism or civil war type violence? Or do you see a way out? And if you see it, what is it?
Well, I'm going to practice the epistemic humility I preach and say, honestly, I don't know. I think that the fact that Trump continues to dispute the election right now, and you have something like, I think the latest ones is about 3/4 of Republicans think that the election was a fraud. I'm afraid that that's going to blow up. And I think that the right and the left are weird mirror images of each other, and I think that we can face disaster from both. And I'm afraid that there's going to be a blow up. There's going to be something really scary happening in the next couple of years, and I'm not sure exactly what. But it's when you have that many of the population who believe the election was stolen, that could get really ugly really quickly. I hope that what happened with Timothy McVeigh in the mid '90s, a horrifying Oklahoma City bombing, that got a lot of people going, whoa, no. Nobody wants that. That's not the way we handle this stuff. I hope it doesn't come to something that horrible. But for the first time I've never heard someone call for martial law in U.S. history. And Michael Flynn taking out that ad saying that he wants martial law. And when you already have sort of a utopian movement on the left, and you have sort of I don't know what to call it, sort of like a nationalist populist movement on the right. That's a scary phenomenon, and I honestly don't know how it ends. What I do know is we need to start thinking, and this is something that I think you could probably help with. We need to start thinking about institutions that people trust. The American Psychiatric Association came out against toxic masculinity, for example, which is absolutely taking a position more or less against men. The American Association of University Professors actually came out in some cases against professors. The New York Times, fires James Bennett because he ran a editorial by a sitting senator. A lot of these institutions have lost people's faith for understandable reasons. And increasingly, I think that there needs to be at least a couple institutions that people all over the spectrum can look at and go, well, at least I trust these guys. And I don't think that exists at the moment. And I think it desperately needs to. Even just one would help.
Well said. Well said. I think that's a good place to tap out. Greg, man, thank you for all the stuff that you put in the world, dude. You're just a voice that I am really, really into. All the First Amendment stuff. I highly encourage people to watch the documentary, Mighty Ira. It's
Nico
really
Perino, it was his passion project, and man, he ran with it.
And if you haven't already read The Coddling of the American Mind, whoo, is that a good one?
Real proud of
that. That is absolutely extraordinary. Where can people engage with you?
Thefire.org. My organization is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We defend free speech, due process, academic freedom on campus, but increasingly we're taking on the role of educating people about small L liberal concepts and freedom of speech. I also have a blog called The Eternally Radical Idea, which is also on fire. Eternally Radical Idea being free speech. It's always a radical idea to every generation, partially embodied by the fact that in every generation people oppose it.
Yeah, sad but true. Guys, really, truly somebody that has blown my mind. I hope you guys will dig into the stuff that we've talked about. And I hope you, from a contextual standpoint, understand why I'm so obsessed with this. This has to do with frame of reference and thinking in a way that allows you to achieve your exciting and hopefully honorable goals. And that is certainly my only desire. And speaking of exciting and honorable, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care.